My name is Julie Godet, and I'll be the main presenter for today's webinar. I'm joined by my colleague Marie Parsons, who is the main content developer of the guide. Marie has had a number of years of experience in the field and is the content expert on conflict resolution. We are also joined by Aisha Sajjad, who serves today as your webinar administrator. So just to briefly review today's agenda, we'll start by talking to you a little bit about the background, the reasons really behind, why we created the guide. We'll talk a little bit about the methodology. We'll introduce very, very briefly the resource guide and its features, and then we'll touch on the module content more specifically. Back in 2013, a report called The Blueprint for Fundamental Change to Ontario's Welfare System was released in light of another document, which is entitled My Real Life Book, Report of the Youth Leaving Care Hearings, that report had recommendations to both recognize and act on the need to really fundamentally change the child welfare system in order to better prepare children and youth in care to succeed. One of the recommendations from the blueprint specifically was to help build the capacity of residential care providers staff in order to respond constructively to challenging child and youth behavior by doing, a couple of things. And the first would be by attempting to understand the needs behind their behavior, and secondly, by addressing those behaviors in ways that encourage children and youth to willingly accept and change their behavior. You see on your screen, we've put some links to those two documents. More specifically, it was recommended that caregivers are trained in three main areas: conflict resolution, crisis prevention, and de-escalation. Today's focus is really in the first box. This resource guide is specifically about conflict resolution. We certainly mention issues related to crises and de-escalation, but this is not what this resource is about. The training specifically is intended to build the capacity of residential care providers to respond to conflicts with residents in more restorative ways and to prevent situations from escalating to the point where police are called to residences in an unwarranted way. So in response to this recommendation, the Ministry of Children and Youth Services funded the development of this particular guide. So in terms of how we went about developing the guide, it was really important to us that the guide be evidence-informed. And so we used two main sources of information. Firstly, we used research, both research literature and gray literature from online databases and through internet searches. And we also used stakeholder interviews to get information about what the needs were. We sought information from, you see on the list, a variety of staff members. Advocacy organizations were also sampled. A couple of the ministries, education, community social services, and of course children and youth services specifically. And of course youth who had been in care and youth currently in care. This is just to show you what the title page of the document will look like. The ultimate purpose of the guide is to build the capacity of staff to respond to conflicts in restorative ways. Ultimately, obviously, it's to improve the experiences and lives of youth and of youth leaving care. In order to do this, we provided, we feel, practical evidence-informed resources for people to use or for people to simply refer to prevent and resolve conflicts in residential care settings. We focus on strategies and tools that can be used either in preventing or in resolving conflicts. They can also be used to help build positive and healthy relationships, and also in building a sort of group home culture and environment that fosters youth engagement and positive youth development. It's certainly not intended as, being all-inclusive. We also want to point out that it really doesn't replace, the value of clinical mentorship, clinical supervision, or the requirement for residential care operators to recruit and train staff that are actually capable of working effectively with youth. In terms of the key resources that we offer, we do have some, albeit limited, resources that offer details on Indigenous approaches to conflicts, and we'll talk about some examples of that later. Also on approaches to the role that diversity plays in conflict resolution and in anti-oppressive approaches and practices in general related to conflict resolution. Essentially, we selected the module topics based on our evidence-informed understanding of conflict dimensions, of prevention and resolution, and predominantly on narrative themes that we obtained during the stakeholder consultation phase. We also are including a variety of resources in the guide that will complement the guide, including current live web links that you can access. We have specific works and tools. We also offer additional reading materials, both in the areas that are discussed in the specific modules, but also in other elements that are related to conflict not covered in the guide. Essentially, we've approached this guide using two broad theoretical lenses. And so findings from the literature, documents and reports produced by governments and not-for-profit organizations, and perspectives of stakeholders engaged to inform the development of the guide are essentially what the guide is grounded in. But the two theories that underpin the work include developmental theory and relational cultural theory. And we did that because we needed to be sure that all of the learning activities that we are proposing in the guide, the case studies, the role plays, and the examples were appropriate to all stages of child and youth development, while at the same time making sure to highlight that psychological well-being is achieved through fostering of healthy relationships. And so that's where the relational or cultural theory is relevant. We feel that essentially the connections between children and youth in care and workers in the residential care context are essential to the relationships that are empowering and to fostering self-growth in these children and youth. And so to that end, we also paid attention to principles that are associated with youth engagement, with empowerment of children and youth, so that we can help develop their capacity to resolve their own conflicts. So a little bit more around our premise or the theoretical framework, so to speak, that we adopted when we developed the content. We feel that there are some foundational elements of alternative dispute resolution, and this is, as I said, based on evidence. First and foremost, we need to accept that conflict is a normal part of human relationships. It's often seen as a competition where there's maybe winners and maybe there's losers, and that there are several common responses to conflict. So for example, avoidance, confrontation, acquiescence, etc. But that conflict, nevertheless, can be an opportunity for change, that Communication as a skill lies at the heart of both conflict and its resolution. That all parties involved in a dispute must be permitted to express and release their emotions in an environment that is safe, and that essentially anger in all its forms is one of the most powerful emotions in a conflict. A few more premises on which we based the content of the guide. Conflict, while can present opportunities for change, becomes more like bullying when it's repeated over and over again and creates, power imbalances. We also emphasize that discipline is different from punishment in that the focus is more on the lessons learned and development of self-discipline as opposed to the consequences for a wrong that was committed. Behaviors of children and youth are determined to a great extent by how they feel about the current state of their physical and psychosocial needs, and that there are many strategies of alternative dispute resolution, but the most commonly used are techniques such as reframing, mediation, and facilitation, and of course, restorative justice. Mediation is viewed as the foundational tool of dispute resolution, and peer mediation allows children and youth the opportunity to develop their own set of skills, their own capacity to resolve conflicts. And lastly, elements of restorative approaches to conflict and mediation techniques can lead to new forms of conflict resolution in residential care settings, taking into account the particular nature of those close group dynamics and the effective relationships which are inherent features of the setting. So now on to the module content and order. So we've organized the guide into 6 modules. They certainly can be completed as standalone modules. We certainly recommend that they be completed sequentially. We developed them using sound pedagogy, consistent with adult learning principles, and used to support workers as they navigate through the content and learning activities. We have module goals, we have tasks, and we have associated learning objectives that are detailed very early in each of the modules, and that serves to orient the users as to what to expect. Topics are introduced respecting the order of each of the learning objectives, and we also provide application activities interspersed throughout in order to provide opportunities for concepts to be applied practically. Users can work through the guide at their own pace, but the guide can also form the basis for a training program. Each of the modules ends with the learning objective for the module, and workers can complete a checklist to ensure they have completed all the module tasks. So now I'm going to present to you the module content in not too many detail, but you'll see sort of a high-level explanation of the content areas covered in each of them. So Module 1, we've entitled Conflict and Conflict Transformation, is intended to provide the basics for understanding the dimensions and the elements of conflicts and present ways in which conflicts can be transformed to facilitate resolution. Modules 2 and 3, Module 2 is entitled Communication in Conflict, and Module 3 is entitled Emotions in Conflict. Both explore the effect that communication and/or emotions have on the prevention, on the escalation, and on the resolution of conflict. Essentially, the first 3 modules are intended to lay the foundation for the rest of the resource guide. Next, we have Module 4, which we've entitled simply Power, examines the role that power plays in conflict and explores one of the most common misuses of power, bullying. We also discuss anti-oppression practice in general, especially in relation to power. Next, we have Module 5, entitled Discipline versus Punishment. And that module explores various behavior management strategies and has a focus on key differences between discipline and punishment. Challenging behaviors in residential care settings are also explored in Module 5, which in turn sets the stage for the final module. Module 6, entitled Alternative Dispute Resolution Strategies, is the final and most comprehensive module in a resource guide. The module begins with strategies of reframing and moves through mediation and facilitation. It describes various peer mediation techniques in detail, and users are encouraged to explore peer mediation with youth. The module concludes with an exploration of restorative approaches to conflict resolution, taking into account their indigenous roots. The guide provides a variety of activities that are intended to allow workers to further understand and develop their own conflict resolution skills. The activities can be completed individually or sometimes with a group. And sometimes it may be more beneficial to take the opportunity to discuss the scenarios or the case studies or the role plays with colleagues. But in addition to activities aimed at developing the capacity of workers, we've also included several activities that can be used or applied with children and youth themselves. We have a variety of case studies and scenarios that provide a variety of challenges that workers may face given the diverse nature of children and youth that they serve. In fact, part of what the consultations was about was for us to get some real live examples of some of those challenges that occur in real life settings. And lastly, we have added what we call knowledge check or knowledge application questions that are included at the end of each module to confirm understanding of the module content. So we used standardized icons throughout each of the modules to symbolize the various types of learning or application activities, and we've applied those symbols consistently across all of the modules. So we have, for example, learning objectives that are included at the beginning of each module, clarifying what the workers are expected to learn upon completion of the module. We also have self-assessment activities or questionnaires that are intended for workers and or for children and youth to reflect on their own thoughts and feelings. Some of those activities may involve priority setting questions or scenarios, or responses to short answer questions, which can form the basis of a group discussion. We also have small group activities that are intended for workers and or child and youth to explore specific topics or situations related to module content, and activities involving children and youth are typically led by workers. We also include critical thinking activities. Those are intended for workers that can be conducted individually or with one or more colleagues or in a group format. And those critical thinking activities are focused on application of knowledge related to the content. We have case study discussions, role plays. Those are intended for workers to either enact themselves or to conduct with age or developmentally appropriate youth. Those activities are focused on integrating knowledge gained in content, and led by a worker. Those selected role plays are intended for children and youth to be conducted individually or in small groups. Lastly, quiz questions are aimed for workers to test their knowledge at the end of each module. We have scenario-based case studies with multiple choice, either single select or multiple select options, We also have match the term activities with multiple choice options. We have priority setting questions that require an ordered set of steps, for example. And we also have short answer questions that ask workers to document short responses to questions or to make decisions about one preferred action or option. And all of those activities are supplemented with blank templates that are located in the appendix of each of the modules so that people can feel free to photocopy those and use as many as they need. This next slide shows you an example of what we call a self-assessment activity. And this is really around, you know, some critical thinking about where people sit on certain topics, certain actions. This next one is an example of a small group activity that would be intended for a leader, one of the workers, and a group of youth. And this particular activity, as you see in the example, explores the differences in power depending on the individual and or the situation. And we are very deliberate in our instructions and in scripting the activity so that, I mean, of course, people can feel free to modify those to their settings or their situation, but they can sort of rely on the script otherwise. The next example is an example of a critical thinking activity. And this is where those blank templates are particularly helpful at the end of each of the modules. People can take those home, fill them out. Facilitators or leaders can use those you know, in subsequent staff meetings, for example, to sort of generate a larger group discussion once people have had a chance to reflect on things individually. And here's an example of a discussion or a role play, one that can be conducted with children and youth. And we're sometimes giving different options. So for example, in this particular one option would be for each child and youth in the group to quietly read a scenario and make a decision as to which choice they would select from a particular list. Another option would be to divide people in small groups and have them role play the scenario, depending on the number of people that you have available. And then following the role play, the group comes back all together in a larger group format to discuss each of the scenarios and arrive at decisions using consensus. So a couple of different options on how to do role plays. And the last example I'll share with you today is the example of one of the quizzes, the knowledge or application check quizzes that is at the end of each of the modules. And this one is a very simple example of multiple choice, single select questions. But they, as I've described earlier, take on different formats. As I'd mentioned a little earlier, we have a lot of tools, templates, and resources for you to use. We include, for example, a glossary of all of the key terms that we used for each of the modules. And throughout the modules, if you come across a key term, we've bolded that one so that it's a reminder that if you needed a definition for it, you could refer back to the glossary. And those are listed on the first page of each of the modules, and they're in the same order as they appear in the module. We also have a list of all of the works that we have cited in each of the modules. We list all of the sources, including recommended resources that are available online. Just to note that all of the web resources that we've included on this list have been reviewed for appropriateness and authoritative rigor. While the majority of recommended web resources are available only in English, we have provided selected available resources that are also available in French. And lastly, we've included blank worksheets, blank templates, in the appendix section of each of the modules that can be photocopied and used as many times for multiple users as needed.